All right, what the hell is consciousness? Why do we give a crap about who defines it when in actuality, I'm going to give you probably one of the best definitions you can possibly have today. The word consciousness can be traced back to different people, different spiritual paths, and even science, and I'm going to break it down with the straight dope today.
The Voices of Victory podcast show.
Voices of Victory.
Vision.
Voices of Victory.
Leadership.
Voices of Victory.
Workplace-related topics.
The Voices of Victory.
Voices of Victory. Voices of Victory. Voices of Victory.
It's time for the show. You are now listening to the Voices of Victory podcast show.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mario Di Leone.
Hello and welcome to the Voices of Victory podcast show. My name is Mario Di Leone. Today we're going to explore the mind and what we call the direction of consciousness and how we take our internal processes and shape the very reality that we actually live in. I am your host, and we're going to take a complete journey. We're going to start from what I call raw input of our five senses, all the way to the reality that we actually experience. So we often hear people say all the time, perception is reality, perception is reality. Well, that works great in terms of customer service. And you know what? Perception is reality. And if that wasn't true, customer service wouldn't exist because they need that data and information for that aspect. But that's half the story. Perception is not reality. What we perceive is simply data, but how we interpret that data, that's what becomes our fucking reality. And today, we'll track this chain step by step, and we'll also see how conditioning and the environment also play a huge role in shaping it all. I want to start off with the very first step. Here we go. The five senses. This is the point of data intake. Everything starts with the five senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. Your senses are constantly just giving you data and information, raw data from your environment. And this is why your environment actually matters so much, that if you're born into or living in a challenging environment, then the sensory data that you actually absorb can be stressful, overwhelming, limiting, or you may actually have to change the environment and do everything in your power to do that. Because changing that environment can improve the quality of sensory data, how you're receiving that information around you in the world. It's giving your mind a better foundation for awareness and interpretation. The next step is conditioning. This is the lens that's over your senses. So you have your senses, but it's literally a lens. Before conscious awareness, conditioning is there. It filters the sensory data. Conditioning comes from your past experience, your traumas, your cultural norms, your belief about flex culture, your upbringing, your learned patterns. And it influences what your brain is actually prioritizing. And you know what? What it ignores is also there, and how it interprets incoming data is there. So a good example is a child that's maybe raised in fear may interpret a loud noise as danger, while another child interprets the same noise as curiosity. So you see how that plays in. Conditioning sets the first layer of interpretation, even before conscious thought actually emerges. And that brings us over to the next step, awareness. This is straight up your internal spotlight. And once your sensory input reaches the brain, the mind's awareness becomes active. And awareness is all about noticing. It's the mind's internal spotlight that it puts on certain things. And guess what? We are in a world where everybody's trying to throw spotlights at us. And this acknowledges sensory data, but it doesn't necessarily shape it just yet. At this stage, conditioning still influences what the awareness actually notices. And that brings us over to the next step, which is attention and directing awareness. So attention is the deliberate direction of your awareness. And we are in a world where attention is the next commodity. Our attention span is in constant competition. Everybody is trying to bring us towards the shiny, bright objects that draw our attention into various directions. But attention it's directing the awareness. Attention is the deliberate direction of awareness. Where your attention goes, your energy and life will start to flow. Attention filters and prioritizes that sensory input even further. And conditioning, heavy conditioning, can create biases in your attention. Past experiences, habits, they all guide what you actually focus on. Someone that's conditioned to expect negativity all the time will naturally focus on the constant potential threats, even in neutral or positive situations. This is why happiness is something you cultivate, not something you're born with. So here's the deal. The next step is thoughts, the internal narratives, the internal stories that you wrap around your identity. The thoughts. Attention generates thoughts. Thoughts are interpreted, they're organized, and they create meaning. We are meaning-making machines, and it creates meaning from that incoming data, that incoming information, because reality is all information. And they are influenced by our conditioned beliefs and our prior experiences. And more importantly, the same sensory information can produce different thoughts in different people. This is why two people can have completely different realities. And you know what? It reinforces the idea, back to what I said, perception alone is not reality. That brings us over to step 6, which is literally emotion. Emotions is the responsive layer. We're either working on our emotional intelligence or we allow our emotions to control us and we fall into the emotional puppeteer, so to speak. And it could happen to anybody. But thoughts trigger feelings and emotions, and the mind's immediate responses to the interpretation. So guess what? Emotions further shape how we interpret reality. And the conditioning strongly influences the emotional responses, the learned fears, the learned habits, the automatic autopilot habits, the way you interpret certain things, maybe color interpretation in terms of how you feel about the color green or the color of a tomato. And emotions create the felt experience, which feels real, even if it's internally generated. That brings us over to the next step, which is interpretation. That's the reality that you experience. Here's the critical insight. Interpretation is reality. Reality as you experience it is not raw sensory data. It's the story that your mind tells you about that data. Two people in the same environment can interpret it differently, creating entirely different realities. And by consciously adjusting attention and thought, you can shift the interpretation and therefore your experience reality. And that brings us over to decisions and actions. At some point, you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to decide. And when you decide, action is to follow right afterwards. Because it's all about manifesting the internal, what's inside you. Interpretation is driving your decisions, and decisions are driving your actions. That's what it's all about. Your choices are going to reflect the interpretation you actually hold. And actions influence the external world. It creates what we call a feedback loop. So what happens is your internal state shapes reality, which generates new sensory information for the next cycle. And that brings us over to the final endpoint, which is reality. The endpoint of the conscious process. What you perceive as reality is the result of the entire chain. Here's the chain that we started with. The 5 senses, which is the raw data intake. The conditioning, which is our learned filters and patterns. Our awareness, which is noticing the data, noticing bits and pieces within our reality. Attention, which is where we're directing our focus. Thoughts, which is the internal narrative creation and the amount of information that's flowing through our mind in terms of thinking. Our emotions, which is the feeling layer, the response layer. Then our interpretation, your reality, is what your mind starts to construct, which takes us over to decisions and actions. And that is what manifests the internal right smack into your external reality. So reality is not purely objective. It is the culmination of interpretation shaped by conditioning, shaped by your attention, shaped by your awareness, shaped by your thoughts, and shaped by your emotions. Understanding this chain, it gives you the power. It gives you the power to intentionally influence the reality that you actually experience. And that's what we call locus of control. All right, having a locus of control that, life can be influenced by me, right? That's what it comes down to. So at the end, we start to hit the last phase, which is conscious intervention. This is the cycle that's changing. Here's the empowering part. This is where it all is. You adjust your environment to provide better sensory data. And yes, this would include also finding a way to move away from where you are. You retrain your attention to focus on growth, opportunity, solutions, and even new ways of thinking, and model the thinking of others that are going to be productive and move you through life. Then, of course, reshaping. Our thought patterns, they need to be reshaped. And our emotional responses also need to be reshaped. So we have to overcome limiting conditioning. But by consciously directing our awareness, our attention, and our interpretation, we can change the reality that we can experience. And often transforming your external world as a natural consequence. Now, if we have a lot of past stuff, we'll call it past emotional things that have happened. We'll say experiences, we'll call them emotional experiences that keep us stuck in the past. Anytime you're stuck in the past, and what happens is you're going to keep going backwards into the thought and feeling, and you're just going to keep replaying that aspect. And it's designed to keep you in the past. And if you're constantly in the future, well, then you may have difficulty with the decisions and actions, which is really important because you're going to have to decide at some point. In between knowledge and the way that knowledge is applied is action and decisions. That's right smack there. So here's what I want to tell you in closing. Just remember, reality is not just out there. It is the interpretation of what your mind is also perceiving as well. It's built from the sensory information. Reality is indeed data, and it's filtered through all the layers. Conditioning, awareness, attention, thoughts, emotions. And reality begins with your senses, but it ends with the interpretation. And when you understand this chain, guess what? You gain the ability to choose your focus, reshape your interpretations, and consciously direct your life. And that's the most important thing. So here's what I say. I'm not going to listen to everybody else's definition of consciousness out there because I do consider myself a leader and I do consider myself to come to the table with a completely different idea. Consciousness, as I define it, is the continuous process of receiving sensory data from reality, and you're filtering it through your conditioning. You're directing it with awareness and attention, and you're shaping it into an interpreted reality that we then live and act upon. That's what it's all about, in my personal opinion. That's my definition right there, and that's the best that I'm going to tell you. Now, we want to bring to the table that reality begins with your senses, but it ends with interpretation. When you understand this big chain that we discussed today, you gain the ability to choose your focus, and retrain your focus so you can reshape your interpretations. And then you can consciously direct your life. I'm Mario De Leone. This is Voices of Victory, the direction of our consciousness. Stay aware, question your conditioning, take charge of the interpretation that shapes your reality, and I'll see you on the next episode.